Hey there! You've stumbled on to a brand new episode of Look at Us Now, the podcast where BIPOC women look and talk back to the world. Whether you're a part of the BIPOC community or looking to be an ally, you've stopped at the right place. Today, we're going to be talking about transnational feminist healthcare, asking the big question, what could a transnational feminist healthcare system look like in the time of COVID? We can't talk about this without talking about collective care, so that will be another central piece. In this episode, we bring in guest host Anam, another curious BIPOC woman ready to go beyond the status quo when it comes to serving, protecting, and advocating for our bodies. Are you ready? We're looking back in 3, 2. Hey there, everyone. I'm Carae Henry, and welcome back to another episode of Look at Us Now. Today, I'm joined by an awesome guest.
Hey there, Carae. How are you? It's Anam Samdani. So let's get into it, yeah? So I'm excited to be here for today's topic, especially in the current pandemic. Reimagining healthcare is so critical. So COVID-19 has been quite an experience for all of us, but it's been especially challenging in areas with the larger populations of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I remember looking at data from recent stats Canada report that revealed in these communities where 25% of the population is a visible minority, the mortality rate for COVID-19 was nearly tripled compared to the communities where less than 10% were visibly minorities.
I mean, that's tough, right? But when we look at it, isn't that the pattern that we're used to? Most recently, the H1 pandemic or H1N1 pandemic in 2009 showed that First Nations people had 3 to 8-fold of an elevated risk of death from respiratory illness or influenza. And this is pretty similar to the coronavirus. So the same health issues that heightened their risk back then still exist today. That's high rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, breathing problems, and even cancer.
But if you're going to talk about this whole issue of Indigenous health gaps or disparities, we can't leave out the bigger piece of settler colonialism. It's a term we may be familiar with, meaning efforts to exert control over and erase Indigenous peoples as the original settlers of a land. But what does it look like in the lived reality? If we put it into terms, the death of Indigenous person is absolutely necessary for the livelihood of colonizers. Indigenous health is a threat to colonization. So it makes sense that past pandemics have done so little to preserve Indigenous life.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point that you make because it's such an important lens to be looking through on it. Because at the heart of so much intergenerational trauma that's compromised Indigenous people today. Colonization, in a way, is a social determinant of health in the same way that low income, education, and living conditions are. We may even say that it's actually the primary social determinant of health for Indigenous people because it's resulted in low income, a lack of education, and often insufficient housing, and even lack of access to food. And of course, when we think about COVID, what has COVID-19 done, right? It's cut income, it's strained education, it's placed a burden on those with inadequate housing. So between the legacy of colonization and the demands of the coronavirus, our Indigenous communities are really being suffocated here.
I want to go a bit more into racism and barriers to healthcare for Black and Indigenous folks. Current conversations around healthcare for BIPOC folks is discouraging, right? You would think that after nearly a decade of training, the people with the power to hold the scalpel would at least be properly equipped to do so, right?
I mean, that's the thing, right? Having the medical skills to practice should only really be seen as half the picture because there's so much ethnocentrism in medical education that focuses on centering white bodies and the experiences that happen to them as the norm, and everybody else is seen as non-essential. And what does this do in the bigger picture of things? It reinforces those power systems that put Black and brown bodies at risk.
Even the tools used to measure health are biased against BIPOC experience. Things such as the Tanner scale, right, that marks phases of sexual and physical development, basically based off white European standards. When BIPOC folks come into the picture, appraisals of us are completely skewed.
Yeah, and I think we need to emphasize it isn't just a matter of preference, right? It's not just, Black and Indigenous and POC people having a gripe with the medical system. It's quite literally a matter of life and death. These are long histories of harm done to Black and Indigenous bodies in healthcare. I'm wondering how many people know that Black women are more than twice as likely to be murdered in the healthcare system alone when compared to white women. this isn't coincidental, or some figure that we try to draw up for shock value. It's a lived reality that stems from misogynoir. This is a term coined by Moya Bailey, which really draws a connection between misogyny affecting women and anti-Black racism affecting Black people that combines to affect Black, cis, and trans women in unique ways.
Mm-hmm. Recent conversations in pop culture have mentioned the harmful narrative that Black people don't feel pain, which is pretty scary to think about, right? And these narratives aren't isolated to Black folks. For example, in Alberta, medical staff at one of the hospitals were exposed to being playing a racist game of what's the blood alcohol level when treating Indigenous patients. Not only is this extremely disrespectful, I feel, but it's directly opposing the goal of providing care, right?
No, definitely. We have to see the medical system as an extension of projects that disempower Black and Indigenous people. In Brazil, the medicalization of sterilization has disproportionately disadvantaged Black women. What does that mean? When you deny Black women autonomy over their bodies and you allow white women to have this privilege, this reaffirms a hierarchy that blocks Black women from gaining the opportunities or any economic power that white women have access to.
I feel like it's the same message wherever you look. This medical system wasn't built for us, but what would it look like otherwise? So
some of the problems we have identified in this episode so far have been the legacy of colonialism, ethnocentrism, misogynoir, and racist discourse that inhibits holistic care of BIPOC folks. So, as Anam and I have been talking about recently, we think that there are 3 key pieces of a transnational feminist healthcare system.
Exactly, the adoption of a cultural humility, right? The approach, as opposed to training in cultural competency. A transnational feminist healthcare system in Canada would be a well-informed or of the histories of harm done to BIPOC bodies, both at home and across the world.
So, as our second step, we took some inspiration from conversations around detasking the police that have been going around a lot on social media recently.
Right.
And just like police are a surveillance system on BIPOC folk, so is our healthcare system. Alternatively, we can recommend that we decentralize healthcare and embrace collective care models.
Very true. If you're wondering what this is, collective care models are those that put the responsibility on all of society's institutions to maintain the health and well-being of its people. This means that the burden of healthcare would not just be the responsibility of doctors and nurses. Instead, it would branch out this task to universities, social services, and workplaces.
Exactly. And that's really what we're hoping to see, the inclusion of programs that focus on both food security for Indigenous folks and increasing their literacy. We have to remember that social determinants of health from earlier, both education and food security, play a role. So why are we treating them as separate? It's a problem when we see healthcare just as something that's medical.
Very true. I totally agree with that. This is what I love about applying a transnational feminist lens to healthcare. It just highlights areas where we can disrupt patterns of inequality. It cannot be an add and stir approach, right?
No,
It has to be a radical one. I think it's fitting then that our third and final step we suggest is to strip our system entirely to tools and practices in which racism, sexism, misogyny, and colonial sentiments are well embedded, right?
Yeah.
For the BIPOC folks, these tools are tools of trauma. Instead of trying to amend them, I think we should build from the ground up. Let's start with the question, what is health? And go from there.
Health is a consideration of trauma. Health is placing BIPOC experience at the center with attention to difference.
Absolutely. So what does this look like in COVID? At a time where BIPOC folks are economically strained, but still fearful of engaging in the system. I think it looks like starting with acknowledgement and validation of this fear first and foremost.
I think as we've seen, Indigenous remote communities have currently been placed as high priority for the vaccine with whatever pushback, but it's absolutely appropriate given the circumstances. But this is really just the beginning. Because if health is going to last beyond this pandemic, we really need to revisit the infrastructure in these communities that are barriers to health and pay close attention to those areas of instability that cause these problems and these inequalities in the first place.
100%. We need to prioritize immediate training of staff that dismantles they don't feel the pain narrative, right? There is no room for error. It could cost somebody their self-esteem, their life, as a person, right?
Exactly. When we think about the experiences, how harsh they've been for people, it's a tough
Yeah,
recovery process. It ignores the essential truth that our health is important, despite what history has told us, and it's really time to make a change about that.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks, Anam, for coming on to our podcast, and thanks to all our listeners for listening to this episode of Look at Us Now, where we talked about ongoing health concerns for BIPOC folks in the time of COVID, and we started to imagine the possibilities for adopting a transnational feminist healthcare system. Of course, this is a great start to the conversation, but that's all it is, a start. So keep the conversation going on social media with your friends as we try to shift the reality of BIPOC health in Canada for the better.
This podcast will use a transnational analysis to unpack the topic of vaccine hesitancy in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities in Canada amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Touching on the past, present, and future, we will explore how histories of medical violence and the ongoingness of settler colonialism shape people's decisions around whether or not to take the vaccine and what Indigenous communities are doing to address the issue.
In 1949, the Canadian government commissioned the construction of a patrol ship called the C.D. Howe as part of a Cold War campaign to assert territorial sovereignty in the Arctic. The ship spent most of its life making annual trips from Quebec City to Ellesmere Island, Canada's northernmost tip, stopping to provide medical services to Indigenous communities along the way. Johnny Williams, a resident of Inukjuak, recalls the C.D. Howe's arrival on the shores of his community in northern Quebec in the 1950s. As Williams recounts, the 91-meter-long ship lowered a tugboat into the icy waters of the Hudson Bay, and a team of doctors, nurses, and armed RCMP officers disembarked. Community members who were deemed in need of medical attention were removed from their tents and forced onto the ship. Though Williams himself made it off the ship, his half-brother was transported south to a sanatorium in Hamilton and never returned. Williams's brother was one of over 1,000 Inuit and First Nations people, including hundreds of children, who were forcibly removed from their communities in the north and northwest of Canada during the 1950s to receive treatment for tuberculosis. Patients were transported to racially segregated sanatoriums, or so-called Indian hospitals, where they were subjected to invasive chest surgery, drug treatment, and medical experimentation, including vaccine trials. In 1953, an amendment to the Indian Act made it illegal for Indigenous patients to refuse treatment or leave a hospital before discharge, crimes that could be punished with imprisonment. Many patients died in the hospitals, and those who survived found themselves thousands of kilometers away from their families and communities. Following Simone Brown, we might think of the tuberculosis sanatoriums as a kind of racializing surveillance that controlled the bodies of those deemed sick and dangerous, as well as a technology of settler governmentality that worked in tandem with the Indian Act, the numbered treaties, the reserve system, residential schools, and later the 60s Scoop to, quote, eliminate Indigenous opposition to settler colonial expansion in the Northwest, as Jeffrey Monaghan puts it. Under the logic of settler governmentality, Monaghan notes, Indigenous peoples were seen as threats to the health of settler society, which was integral to its expansion. This was made especially clear when the Department of Indian Affairs wrote that, quote, if this program is increased from year to year, we can look forward to the control of tuberculosis amongst the susceptible people, and at the same time a removal of a menace to the adjacent white population, end quote. As the only Coast Guard vessel transporting Indigenous patients from the north to the south, the C.D. Howe played a crucial role in the so-called removal of a menace to the white population. Borrowing from Simone Brown, we ask, what might the view from under the hatches of the C.D. Howe tell us about medical skepticism amongst Indigenous communities in the Canadian Northwest today? How do histories of medical violence and the ongoingness of settler governmentality come to bear on the issue of vaccine hesitancy amidst the COVID-19 pandemic?
Presently, the Canadian government has shown some initiative in understanding the perspectives and realities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people when distributing the vaccines. But there are still ongoing challenges with the government treating the rollout transactionally rather than trying to understand the specific circumstances and intergenerational histories of vaccine hesitancy stemming from colonialization. Jeffrey Monaghan explains that during early settler expansion, Indigenous people were forced to make decisions between life and death, either comply with the white settler way of living or exist on the margins. Today, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities still live under the liberal surveillance complex that monitors those who are deemed deviant and a potential threat to settler society. Because of historical malpractice and experimentation, including the so-called Indian hospitals, there is evidently deep suspicion of vaccines and the medical system more broadly in Indigenous communities. For instance, some elders in the Northwest Territories view vaccines as bad medicine. With the current climate of COVID-19, acceptance is made ever harder due to the fear-mongering spread across social media, compounding historical traumas. Since the government has failed these communities in the past, politicians' words carry little strength, making it easy to believe superstitious narratives that raise the questions, are we test subjects or not?
This is Khan Tunedahorn, an elder from the Mohawk Bear Clan, discussing the COVID-19 vaccine as part of the Maduking Mishkiki initiative out of Women's College Hospital.
I think the main thing is that we're not being asked for our input, for our consent, and that's what worries us. Some of us are old enough to remember how badly we've been treated health-wise, and so that's still in our mind. And what happened to us in the past, and I'll tell you that really shakes us up. Like myself, I'm afraid that my name might go on a list, and because I didn't take the vaccine, we don't know what's going to happen. You know, we feel like we're being used as lab rats, and that's what they did in the past.
The case of Joyce Echaquan is evidence that the mistreatment of Indigenous people is still ongoing, with the racist remarks being thrown at her while she was dying. These events provide little trust within the medical systems and ultimately lead Indigenous communities to stray away from the healthcare systems because they run the risk of slandering stereotypes and poor treatment due to their culture. Echaquan is one of the many stories that have called for action against the injustices and mistreatment in these communities. Therefore, the greatest challenge presently faced is building the trust of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Looking to the recent past, the 2009 H1N1 vaccine rollout, it took people nearly 4 months to feel comfortable taking the vaccine because of the deep-rooted medical skepticism. Nurses wondered why they were not mobilized sooner when it came to public health education on the vaccine. The same goes for the COVID-19 vaccine today. Frontline Indigenous leaders in the Northwest Territories say that there are few public notices in their communities and that health centers are not providing enough information. They are calling on nurses to come to their communities to address concerns.
Looking forward, a transnational feminist approach to the subject of vaccine hesitancy seeks to explore issues of globalization and cultural imperialism within the healthcare system, with a specific focus on indigeneity, racializing surveillance, and settler governmentality. It is no surprise that there are barriers to the uptake of COVID-19 vaccination across First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities in the Northwest because the government has not provided relevant educational materials about vaccination that addresses the history of medical violence we have discussed in this podcast, as well as the ongoing barriers that contribute to the lack of cultural safety for Indigenous peoples within the healthcare system. A transnational approach to vaccine hesitancy must account for how the West has influenced healthcare and vaccination campaigns for all people all over the world, with a particular attention to what Simo Brown calls, and I quote, technologies of social control that exercises a power to define what is in or out of place. In Canada, public health officials and medical professionals must recognize how this type of control is deeply connected to and embedded in histories and present-day institutional and individual racism, as well as social policies and practices. It is important to note that Indigenous communities flourished prior to colonization and continue to hold intergenerational wisdom about health and well-being. Many individuals and collectives in communities have stepped up in response to government inaction on the profound impact of colonialism on health and vaccine hesitancy for indigenous peoples today. For example, First Nations leaders and chiefs in the Northwest Territories are taking COVID-19 vaccines first in order to model for their communities. The stars from Tilicho First Nations have been phoning elders regularly and providing radio programming in their language to keep people updated on the vaccine's rollout. Here in Ontario, the Indigenous-led Madukin Mashkiki initiatives create a space to, and I quote, unpack biomedicines, traditional knowledge, and healing practices through oral storytelling and visualization to support First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people in making informed choices around vaccines. Thinking about the ways in which a transnational feminist outlook might approach vaccine hesitancy, public health officials and medical professionals should work towards better transparency and accountability within the Indigenous communities by, number one, forming partnership with Northwest Indigenous people and frontline leaders, agencies, and communities as a requirement for the rollout of vaccines and educational campaigns. Number two, providing accurate and relevant information about medical concepts related to COVID-19 vaccination with consent and trust developed through consultation with local elders from Indigenous communities, collectives, and nations. Number three, centering the personal historical experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people when sharing Western biomedical and health information that is specific to COVID-19's transmission, vaccination, and prevention. Lastly, using a decolonial approach to unpack the concept of vaccine hesitancy that addresses the relationships and connections between Indigenous traditional knowledge and medicine in comparison to Western biomedicine in understanding the COVID-19 vaccination.
A transnational feminist healthcare system like this would strive towards health equity for Indigenous people in the Northwest and across Canada by centering traditional knowledge while ensuring transparency and accountability on the part of the government, public health officials, and medical professionals. The decolonial work of frontline leaders, healthcare providers, elders, and knowledge keepers in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada show us that this is possible. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Heart House Stories for providing resources on how to make this podcast.
Abstinence is key. Sex ed that doesn't click. The history of gynecology is filled with both sexism and racism. The enslaved people that the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, operated on were not given anesthesia, even though gynecology was literally built on the bodies of these Black women. Black women in the US are more likely to give birth prematurely, have underweight babies, and have poor pregnancy and birth outcomes than white women in households of similar resources, as stated in the documentary When the Bough Breaks. We would like to move with this background in mind to the issue of sexual education.
Sexual education, which we consider the upriver work of gynecology, differs in quality and effectiveness depending on the school it is delivered in. While the United States government does not have a clear definition of what sexual health is or an implemented comprehensive sexual health curriculum, the CDC suggests that a quality sexual health education provides students with the knowledge and skills to help them be healthy and avoid HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, and unintended pregnancy, though it is up to each state to determine what is and isn't taught in schools. This is of high interest to us because it can serve as a prevention tactic to some of the troubles that young Black women and girls face. As Bailey and Peoples write, discrepancies in perceived sexuality and sexualization between Black and white girls is well seated in society. This affects rates of sexual violence and STI acquisition. Jaskowski and Crawford write that despite national declines in HIV transmission since 2016, the disparity between African American and white teen HIV diagnoses out of 100,000 is stark, with rates of 93.5 versus 9.8 respectively. Not only is there a clear need for good sexual education, We want to argue that the current strategy isn't working and is doing so unjustly.
Many teens are only prevented with the advice, the best kind of birth control is abstinence. This train of thinking is called abstinence-only education. Abstinence-based sex education is often riddled with gender discrimination, like comparing women who have sex before marriage to a dirty shoe. Not only that, but teen pregnancy rates are higher in states with abstinence-centered sex education programs. A large body of research has found no evidence that providing young people with sexual and reproductive health information and education results in increased sexual risk-taking. And furthermore, the American Adolescent Sources of Sexual Health Information 2017 report showed that, as of 2015, fewer than 6% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students aged 13 through 21 reported that their health classes had included positive representations of LGBT-related topics.
We spoke with 4 college students from Boston who took sex ed in high school. Michelle and Manuela went to the same Boston public school, while Anat and Katrina are from well-to-do suburbs in the area. First, we asked them, what are 3 words to describe your sex ed experience? First, from Michelle and Manuela.
It would be lacking, awkward, uncomfortable.
Lacking, underwhelming, and old school.
Next, from Anat and Katrina.
Thorough, useful,
awkward, disappointing, minimal, forgetful. I really don't remember it.
Okay. Quite the variety. Now, let's hear what they have to say, starting with the suburb students.
My name is Inat Gavish. My high school is mostly white with a significant Asian population. It is relatively wealthy. The main sex ed class is either the first half or the second half of freshman year. The workbook was actually pretty great. We would also have speakers come. It was very fitted to the situation. And I still remember them even though it's been a lot of years. We talked about consent to the extent where we would have scenarios and we would practice saying no. They had us talk to our parents about some of the stuff. I guess we talked about the LGBTQ community in general. And then we did talk about sexual assault. They were never don't have sex. Abstinence only wasn't at all the focus of it. Our PE classes were electives. So there was an opportunity to take a sex ed too. Do you know I still think about it? The things that they said in class, I still remember.
Okay, so first, can I have you introduce yourself?
My name is Katrina Liu. That is Katrina-Liu. So our high school is combining 2 towns. Mostly everyone was well off enough. Mostly white, not gonna lie to you. Honestly, if I learned anything more about anatomy of sex and stuff, I learned it more in biology class than health. There was a lot of talk about consent. And then the main message was kind of do it if you want to do it. And if you want to do it, here are your options. So I don't think abstinence was, I don't remember that being, we talked about relationships and healthy relationships and what goes into a healthy relationship. I guess we don't really talk about race because we are so white. You know what I mean? If anything, I learned so much more about that when I came to BU when there's many different kinds of people here. But it just really sucks, actually. I look back and I'm yeah, it was so, because I guess they just don't feel the need, because what's the need if there's no one out in their population, which is really twisted.
Next, let's hear from the city students.
My name is Michelle Nee. I did not grow up in white suburbia like Katrina. I came from a high school that was really diverse. Oh yeah, we were broke as hell. So I think that sex ed was more kind of a last minute thing rather than something that we should focus on more. It was more of a class just to get by. I learned more about sex ed on TikTok, on Instagram. It was more about abstinence more than sex positive. I thought the bare minimum about sex education would be pregnancy, and even that wasn't even covered that much. I think the reason why my school focused so heavily on drugs is because the fact that we did have a drug issue. So there was a section where they would be talking about fetishes and stuff like that, because as an Asian American woman, I also hear a lot of shit's this exotic and blah 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 and such, and I'm Like, there was never, like, a area that touched base on that subject. I think it wasn't intertwined enough with, like race and like, society and just, like, people. It was just very, as I said, like, textbooky and stuff. Like, it was just, like, all, like, definitions based. Like, that, what does the definition of STT, like, matter? Like, what does it matter unless, like, you, like connect it with, like, a real life experience or of a sort? I think I just wanted to learn about what the hell sex is and, like, what does it, like, mean. So you have, like, a bunch of these, like, like lost children, I would say, like, or, like, kind of confused kids about what sex is, and then just, like, figuring it out and exploring on our own. For sex ed, I wish I learned more about, like, gender identity.
Yes, but I don't think that's the way that people are going to learn. Almost everyone wasn't interested in it. I think because they focused so much on STDs, and it's also, like, we were using pretty old textbooks.
Did you ever talk about sexual violence or consent?
No, we are not really having, like, sexual education beyond heterosexual partners or, like, straight people, especially because I am queer, so...
While these interviews only capture the experiences of 4 Boston area students, they're a microcosmic reflection of how sex ed in the U.S. works. While sex ed is not perfect in any of these schools, resources are most often pooled into white, affluent areas where students get more robust educations, while lower-income BIPOC schools regurgitate outdated curriculums. In the extreme, this can lead to 2 separate populations, one equipped with knowledge on how to have healthy sexual relationships and one not, feeding into the cycle of worse health outcomes for people of color.
One example of what sexual education can look like is an MIT group called Pleasure, which is a student-run, peer-led sex ed organization with the goal of ending sexual violence at MIT. For them, sex ed is gender inclusive. Minority genders are discussed, non-heterosexual sex is discussed. But more than sex, one of the main objectives of Pleasure is to go about sex ed with a focus on the person, rather than the body parts. As a pleasure educator myself, one of the things I wished someone had taught me that I now know is how to be specific about my boundaries. I used to think that boundaries only meant saying no if someone asked you for sex. Now I know that boundaries are for positive things too. Do touch me there. Do speak to me this way. And for much more basic things in any kind of relationship.
In conclusion, we want to talk about sexual education because often minoritized groups are used to getting their boundaries crossed and may not have the tools to set boundaries and know what to do if their boundaries are crossed. Also, defining someone as other makes it easier to rationalize hurting them, so layers of disadvantagement play into sexual violence, which has always been about power and never has been about sex. Furthermore, most youth get their sex education online, and it's often inaccurate, i.e. porn, where gender and racial stereotypes are magnified. The American Adolescent Sources of Sexual Health Information 2017 report states that there is a lack of conversation about contraceptives, but prevalent STI conversation.
Our recommendation is a sex ed curriculum that talks about boundaries and power. We wanted to talk about intersectionality because identity and power are instrumental in unpacking sex. Specifically, we'd like to avoid the use of problem-focused language. For example, claiming that being a person of color is a risk factor or a problem needing to be fixed. Furthermore, we want an education that dismantles taboos and stigmas, such as talking about masturbation and non-heteronormative sex. We want anatomical models in different skin tones because whiteness should not be the default. By making the conversation about boundaries and power, there's no reason to wait until high school to get sex ed. We'd like to start educating kids young. We'd like to see focusing on how we can form healthy sexual relationships rather than simply delaying sex.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We would like to thank our interviewees for sharing their experiences. as well as Dr. Moya Bailey for providing us with the time and guidance to explore this topic. If you leave with one thing, intersectionality, not abstinence, is the key.
It has been 5 years since I first worked with a psychiatrist. Since then, I have had both inpatient and outpatient mental health care and maintenance. I remember one particularly traumatic experience I had at a hospital in Washington, D.C. I was at a conference and had a crisis. My doctor referred me to the hospital. During the wait time, I was taken into a padded cell. I was very anxious because of the confinement and feared that I was being observed and monitored. My story gives us a glimpse into how medical institutions function through carceral means.
Today, we'll be talking about the systemic parallels between psychiatric institutions and prisons in the U.S. I'm Elaine.
I'm Sahithi.
And I'm Diane. Let's explore the racist and sexist history of psychiatric institutions and how they serve as sites of incarceration in the present day.
To understand mental institutions today, we need to go back to the 19th century when many asylums opened due to a pervasive belief that the state should take care of people who were incapable of taking care of themselves. The state took on this paternalistic role in mental health care, which often manifested as racism and sexism in the asylum.
So, how did racism play a role in the evolution of psychiatry and the asylum?
That's a complex question. Mental disorders were defined to drive sociopolitical goals. This took form in many deeply disturbing ways. To learn more about how psychiatry was used as a tool of social control, we spoke with Ziggy Waller from Health Justice Commons, a group organizing around health justice and disrupting the medical industrial complex, or the MIC.
Hi, I'm Ziggy from Health Justice Commons. I'm a social media and communications intern. So during chattel slavery, psychiatrists, they would use diagnoses to basically justify slavery. So they accused abolitionists of having something called monomania, which is an obsession with a single goal. And they also came up with illnesses called drapetomania and diasesthesia, which they assigned to enslaved Africans who escaped slavery or weren't deemed docile enough. So this clearly shows how African people resisting enslavement were marked as ill for behaving outside the norms and demands of white supremacist social control and repression.
Examples of race-based diagnoses are pervasive today. For example, schizophrenia had initially been considered a condition affecting harmless white housewives. In the 1960s, psychiatry began to view schizophrenia as an aggressive condition afflicting Black men, with neuroscientists going so far as advocating brain surgery to prevent violence.
In the 70s, psychiatrists added the word aggressive to schizophrenia's DSM diagnostic definition, and then the pharmaceuticals were directed towards controlling Black patients. And present day, one of the effects is race-based medicine and pharmaceuticals like Biddle, which is a medication for heart disease specifically targeted to Black Americans. Black people are often offered medication for mental illness at a lower rate than the general population. And this indicates decreased access to consensual healthcare and highlights health interventions that are forced or coercive.
Admissions to asylums were also deeply gendered, with women being far more likely to be admitted and having a harder time living. Those who had less economic and social power, poor people and immigrants, were more likely to be viewed as burdens on their family and to end up in the asylum.
In 1887, journalist Nellie Bly faked insanity and went undercover in the Blackwell's Island Asylum for her exposé, 10 Days in a Madhouse. Her experience illustrates how conditions within asylums fail to support recovery. She reported, "What, accepting torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? I would like the expert physicians to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up and make her sit from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. on straight back benches, give her no reading, and let her know nothing of the world or its doings, give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. While Bly was able to leave, many people without family to support them would spend their entire lives inside the asylum.
Bly's words are strongly reminiscent of prison structure. Asylums of the past and psychiatric institutions today mirror prisons in many ways. Both involve confinement, restrictions on daily activities, physical restraints, and involuntary entry. Ziggy told us,
in original asylums, people had a court case before they were institutionalized, and practices continue. People on involuntary psych holds go before a court within psychiatric institutions to decide whether they can be held long term. And the court has the power to decide if they're fit for freedom. In this way, psychiatric labeling acts like criminal statutes and the way they can lead to carceral confinement.
Prisons also model psychiatric institutions. Ziggy pointed out
diagnoses can act as ways to divert people into confinement of the MIC through psychiatric institutions, or in case of migrant asylum seekers, ICE internment, where people were pathologized for their resistance and suffering, over-medicated into submission. For example, in April 2018, Shiloh Detention Center in Houston, Texas, was brought to trial for forcibly injecting children with psychiatric drugs to subdue them.
Ultimately, both prisons and mental institutions seek to separate someone from society. This often has the effect of reinforcing what conditions are normal and allowed to exist in community. Through this mechanism, prisons and mental institutions have the power to reflect and magnify structural oppression.
psychiatric institutions have been used to locate disruptions to the social order in an individual's abnormal psychology. Because the problem is located in the person, it appears justified to simply move the person away from society. However, this kind of thinking does nothing to solve social problems and is actively harmful.
Following the Parkland shooting, Trump remarked, "Years ago, we had mental hospitals, institutions, and a lot of them have closed. Today, if you catch somebody, they don't know what to do with him. He hasn't committed a crime, but he may very well, and there is no mental institution." This was quite an extreme view. Go up and talk to the lonely kid to prevent them from becoming a serial killer, or institutionalize someone to prevent them from committing crimes that haven't yet happened.
In this view, we see an equivalence between mental institutions and prisons, and a lack of distinction between mental illness and crime. Fundamentally, this worldview championed by psychiatric institutions teaches us to view people as threats to themselves or others. How many times have we heard the myth or seen in the media that mentally ill people are violent? There are instances where people do harm, but constructing people into menaces is incompatible with the culture of care. This is especially dangerous when we live in a society that assumes Black people are inherently threatening, that white people are under attack, and that it is better to be safe than sorry.
There's obviously a lot of work to be done in moving to a system that prioritizes individual and community healing rather than social control. Knowing these flaws in our mental health treatment system, how do we proceed?
In the past year, the prison abolition movement has gained a lot of attention in the media. Many supporters of prison abolition advocate mental health care as an alternative to prisons, but there has been much less attention on how the mental health system itself is a site of incarceration. This history around psychiatric institutions also contributes to mistrust of the mental health system among BIPOC communities. We asked Ziggy about their thoughts on whether psychiatric institutions can be reformed or whether abolition is necessary.
From what I've gathered about the history of asylums and psychiatric institutions, I don't believe they were created for care. Similarly to police and prisons, I don't think systems that were created for harm can be reformed for care. Additionally, in order for abolition of psychiatric institutions to really be impactful and sustainable, prisons and police have to be abolished as well because they're so connected.
So what might abolition look like?
I'm not entirely sure what a new system would look like, but I would imagine it would include things like tools for at-home care, equal access to research and knowledge, equal access and community control over knowledge could potentially create a more balanced dynamic between healers and patients. In this system, people in need of care would not be put in isolation to attain that care. And in order for this new system to work, where we're not relying on institutions, our culture really needs to emphasize caring for one another.
Thank you, Ziggy. There's a lot to think about and a lot of work to be done to create a society which prioritizes, as BFHSS envisions, the health and well-being of marginalized groups.